When this case happened 27 years ago, I was 27, almost 28. I had problems with alcohol, I was using the white stuff, I was into hard drugs. I was still really immature for being 27. I had a lot of anger issues, and I was a wild man, totally out of control.
After spending 27 years on death row, Charles Victor Thompson met his end in Texas. His name became tied to a brutal double homicide that shook the state in 1998. It happened in the spring in North Houston, inside an ordinary, quiet apartment complex. There, 3 lives crossed paths in a stormy relationship that was destined to end in tragedy. Jealousy, alcohol, and drugs mixed together in a night of violence, the consequences of which would reach far beyond those first few hours.
It was Thursday, April 30th, 1998. In the United States, images of Daniel Hint Jones's televised suicide, which had happened just hours earlier on a Los Angeles freeway, were still being replayed on the morning news. On the radio, it played nonstop. All My Life by KC. And JoJo? The country kept moving forward, as always, while a private tragedy was brewing far from the cameras. In North Houston, at the Waterman Crossing apartment complex, the early morning hours passed by without anything to set them apart from any other night. It was a quiet residential area with low-rise buildings, open parking lots, and yellow lights that barely pushed back the darkness. The air was humid, the silence fragile. In one of those apartments lived Glenda Dennis Hayslip, 39 years old. A mother to a teenage son named Wade and a working woman, she had spent the past year in an unstable relationship with Charles Victor Thompson, age 27. Thompson drank heavily and was financially dependent on her. Their life together was marked by constant arguments and episodes of violence. Hayslip had decided to end the relationship. Thompson wouldn't accept it. That night, Denise was not alone. With her was Darren Keith Kane, a 30-year-old bartender. He was her new partner, a change that Thompson saw as a direct threat. Hours earlier, around 2 in the morning, Hayslip and Thompson had returned together to the apartment after closing the bar where they worked. They had been drinking. They were still talking, dragging along tensions that never really got resolved. Then the phone rang. It was Darren Kane. Thompson answered the call. The conversation was brief and hostile. Thompson challenged him to come to the apartment. Kane accepted. Around 2:30 in the morning, Kane arrived at Waterman Crossing. The confrontation was immediate. There was no conversation. There was a physical fight inside the apartment. Punches, shoving, yelling. Thompson lost the fight. The scene ended with neighbors alerted and a call to the police. The officers arrived shortly after. They intervened and escorted Thompson out of the apartment. The door closed. The hallway returned to silence. Everything suggested the episode had ended there. But it hadn't. About 3 hours later, around 6 in the morning, Thompson returned to the complex. The sky was beginning to brighten over Houston when he kicked the door in and entered the apartment. Darren Kane was sitting in the living room. Thompson didn't give him time to react. Without saying a word, he pulled out a gun and fired 4 times. Kane collapsed to the floor and died instantly. Denise screamed and tried to escape. Thompson calmly reloaded the gun. He looked at her and said, "I can shoot you too, bitch." Then he pressed the gun against her cheek and fired. The bullet went through her jaw. Denise fell to the floor, bleeding, still conscious, struggling to breathe. Thompson left the apartment and walked away. Some neighbors, awakened by the gunshots, began to peek out their doors and windows. Inside the apartment, Denise dragged herself as best she could. Her face was shattered. She was struggling to breathe, and every movement was an extreme effort. She managed to reach the hallway and then the door of a neighbor. She knocked. She asked what out. She kept leaning forward so she wouldn't choke on her own blood. Before emergency services arrived, she wrote a note addressed to her Uncle Mike. It simply said, "Chuck did this." Minutes later, the ambulances and police arrived. The paramedics found a devastating scene. Darren Kane was lying lifeless in the living room with wounds to his chest and torso. Denise was urgently stabilized and airlifted to a hospital in Houston. Great efforts were made to save her, but during the transfer, her treatment suffered a serious complication. The breathing tube slipped out of her trachea, leaving her without oxygen for between 5 and 10 minutes. The brain damage was irreversible. On May 6, 1998, 6 days after the attack, Dennis Hayslip would be taken off life support. At Waterman Crossing, investigators worked for hours inside the apartment. The forensic experts collected shell casings, photographed the scene, and marked the bullet trajectories. The forced door, the bullet impacts in the living room, and the distribution of blood. They confirmed that this was not an accident or a robbery, but a deliberate and targeted attack. Very soon, all eyes turned to the same person. Hours before the shooting, Thompson had been in that same apartment and had been escorted out by the police after a fight. On top of that was the note Denise Hayslip managed to write before being taken away. A direct identification. For the detectives, it wasn't an isolated accusation, but a confirmation that fit with the previous sequence of events and with the testimonies from the complex. From that moment on, the search focused on the main suspect. Later, it was learned that he spent the hours after the attack at a friend's house. There, he talked, told her what had happened, described the gunshots, and explained what he did afterward. He didn't present himself as a confused or disoriented man, but as someone who remembered every step of that early morning. Shortly after, he got in touch with his father. It was his father who personally took him to a police station. He turned himself in without resistance. He admitted to having fired the shots, but the weapon used was not in his possession. He said he had discarded it in a creek north of Houston. With Thompson in custody, investigators began to review his background. They didn't find any prior homicide charges, but they did find a persistent pattern: alcohol and cocaine use. From an early age, repeated run-ins with the law during his teenage years, and documented episodes of violence in previous relationships. All of that helped to build a profile of the man they had in front of them. The weapon turned up weeks later, thanks to information from an informant. It had been thrown into a nearby body of water. Ballistics tests confirmed that it had been used in the attack. By then, the investigation was no longer looking for basic answers. The questions had changed, and the direction of the case was sealed. Charles Victor Thompson was born on June 13, 1970. At the time of the events, he was 27 years old. He grew up in the Houston area in a stable family environment, but from a very young age he began to show problematic behavior. Alcohol and drug use became a part of his life early on and remained a constant throughout his adulthood. He didn't hold steady jobs. He lived erratically, alternating between periods of occasional employment and long stretches of financial dependence on others. His personal relationships were usually intense and conflictive, marked by jealousy, impulsiveness, and a constant need for control. Those who knew him described him as volatile, emotionally immature, and unable to accept boundaries. He met Denise Hayslip in that context. The relationship started as mutual support, but quickly turned into an unbalanced dynamic. For Thompson, Denise was not just a partner. She was a support, an anchor point, and, over time, an obsession. When that bond broke, he didn't know how, or didn't want to accept the loss. What happened next was neither an accident nor an isolated impulse. It was the result of a buildup of frustrations, dependency, and poorly managed anger. And that combination, all too common, is what makes this story disturbingly close to home. The trial against Charles Victor Thompson began in the spring of 1999 in Harris County, Texas. From the start, it was clear this wouldn't be a brief or simple process. The charge was serious. Capital murder for causing the death of more than one person during the same criminal episode. The prosecution's strategy was direct and forceful. They presented a chronological account of the attack, backed by forensic evidence, neighbors' testimonies, and the confession Thompson had made in the hours following the crime. The forensic experts explained the mechanics of the gunshots and made it clear that the weapon had been reloaded during the attack, a detail that reinforced the intent. The defense tried to focus its strategy on a key point, the death of Denise Hyslop. They argued that her death was not caused directly by the gunshot, but rather by a subsequent medical failure during her treatment. To support that theory, they presented a medical expert who suggested that, with different care, Hyslop might have survived. However, under cross-examination, the expert himself admitted that without the initial gunshot, Denise would never have been in that situation. During the trial, witnesses close to the accused also testified, including friends and family members, who described his behavior before and after the events.
It was the last time we were out together, and then we go home. We leave the bar at 2 a.m., and I'm just wasted. I couldn't even drive. I would drive drunk all the time because she was usually drunk too, but I was in such condition that I gave her the keys and told her I'm seeing double. I can't drive at all. And when we got to her place, I'm putting the key in the door and the phone's ringing. I looked at her and said, who's calling you? I looked at my watch, like, who's calling your place at 3 a.m. in the morning? I wonder, is that your boyfriend, Darren? And so I went in and picked up the phone and said, what do you want? And it was Darren. And he said, let me talk to Denise. I said, oh, is this Darren? He says, yeah, let me talk to Denise. I said, she's with me now. You're barking up the wrong tree, dude. He's like, well, I'll be right over. I said, oh, you've been here. You know where she lives? He's like, yeah, I'll be right over. And
all right, so hold on. Let's go back to this real quick. The event was on April 30th. What day of week was this?
This was a Thursday morning.
Thursday morning. Okay. Wednesday night, 2 a.m. So basically, you had a coked out dude come flying at you, or something of the sort, and like what we're talking like 4 in the morning, right? Somewhere around there.
Yeah, we fought. We threw down. We fought hard. And came out, told us, stop. And I guess the neighbor, probably one of the neighbors, called the police. One shows up, 2, 3. They put me in cuffs and put me in the back of the car, like I'm going to jail or something, right? And I'm looking at what's going on as they're all shaking hands with Darren and slapping him on the shoulder, and, the bro handshake, and what's up, man? And I could tell that he knew them, and they knew him well. Because it's the bro handshake, and they come over to the car, and they open the back door, and they tell me, whoa, man, he got you good in the eye, boy. That's going to be a shiner in the morning, son.
But the most shocking moment came when the prosecution introduced a recording obtained while Thompson was in custody. Between July and August of 1998, he had tried to hire a hitman to kill key witnesses in the case, especially a Ton, Diane Cernia, the friend who had overheard him confess. When that plan was discovered, he tried a second plot to eliminate Cernia, Hyslop's brother, the undercover investigator, and the informant who had exposed his first attempt. Believing he was talking to criminals, who were actually police informants named Jack Reed and Robin Rhodes, Thompson described targets, methods, and prices. In letters from jail, he called himself the Chalkster Killer. The recording, obtained in an undercover operation, left the jury in silence. For the prosecution, it demonstrated more than just guilt. It showed an extreme and persistent danger. After deliberating for barely 3 hours, the jury delivered its verdict. Several later said that the emotional impact of the case had left them physically ill. Charles Victor Thompson was found guilty of murder. Capital. The judge handed down the sentence shortly after. Death penalty. His fate was sealed. After the sentence, Charles Victor Thompson was transferred to Texas death row. He would remain there for more than 2 decades, years marked by strict confinement, unchanging routines, and a series of legal appeals aimed at avoiding execution. The defense immediately began the appeals process. They filed motions in state and federal courts, including habeas corpus petitions. The central focus of these arguments was always the same: to challenge the cause of Denise Hayslip's death. The lawyers insisted that her death was not a direct result of the gunshot, but rather a later medical complication during transport and hospital care. Based on that logic, they argued that Thompson should not be held responsible for capital murder. But the courts reviewed every argument. Judges and experts re-examined medical reports, statements, and the case's background. At every stage, the courts reached the same conclusion. Without the gunshot, Denise Hayslip would not have been in a critical condition. The causal chain was clear. The appeals were rejected, one after another. During those years, Thompson led a quiet life within the prison system. There were no public displays of remorse or visible attempts to rebuild his image. However, in November 2005, just a month after his resentencing, something happened that put his name back in the headlines. Thompson managed to escape from the Harris County Jail in Houston. He didn't use violence. He did it with cunning. Inside his cell, he took off his handcuffs and swapped his orange jumpsuit for civilian clothes he had hidden: a blue shirt, khaki pants, and white sneakers. He left with a fake ID, claiming to be from the Office of the Attorney General. No one stopped him. He calmly walked out to the exit. He was one of only 3 inmates in Texas history who managed to escape while on death row. He remained on the run for 4 days. He crossed the state line to Shreveport, Louisiana, where he was captured outside a liquor store. He was drunk, using a payphone. During those days, he pretended to be a Hurricane Katrina evacuee to get food, clothes, and money. The episode generated a strong media reaction and reinforced the perception that he remained a risk, even in custody. After his recapture, he returned to death row. The years kept passing by. His appeals ran out. The judicial avenues were definitively closed. Finally, the governor of Texas signed the execution order. The date was set for January 28, 2026. After nearly 3 decades, the time for appeals had run out. On January 28, 2026, at 6 p.m. Central Time, Charles Victor Thompson was executed at the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas. He was 55 years old and had spent about 27 years waiting for this moment on death row.
In Texas, there is no option to request a last meal. The inmate's final words will be posted in a pinned comment on this video once they are released.
In the weeks leading up to the date, his pro bono attorney, Eric Allen from Ohio, had requested clemency from the governor of Texas. Thompson, for his part, had expressed deep remorse for what had happened. In letters and interviews, he said he regretted taking 2 lives and causing so much pain to the families. Darren Kane's family and Denise Hayslip's friends pushed for years for the sentence to be carried out. For them, closure only came when Thompson faced the final consequences of his actions. Hayslip's son, Wade, had testified at a hearing. "She wouldn't have been in the hospital if you hadn't shot her." That sentence summed up the argument of the prosecution and the families. If Thompson hadn't fired the shot, none of this would have happened. The hospital didn't kill Denise Hayslip. He did. Public or victim's family reaction? Nah. He was the first person executed in the United States in 2026. It was also the first execution under Harris County's new district attorney, Sean Tier.
Over the years, the case of Charles Victor Thompson left a trail of facts that are hard to ignore. A crime committed in just a few hours, an investigation marked by direct evidence, a trial filled with disturbing recordings, and an entire life spent behind concrete walls. Even after the conviction, the case kept taking unexpected turns. Attempts to silence witnesses, an unexpected escape, decades of appeals, and a wait that seems to never end. For some, his execution was the only just ending to this story. For others, nothing can make up for the losses or restore what was shattered that early morning in Houston. In cases like this, justice doesn't always bring relief or resolution. Sometimes it only marks the end of a tragedy. Has justice been served? That's for you to decide. If you want to keep exploring stories where crime, the law, and fate cross paths in extraordinary ways, we invite you to comment, subscribe, and check out more cases. This was Final Sentence.